Never Again, A Diary of the Great War by Herbert Gregory. Introductory. How I came to write this book. After 3 months training in England, I was, with others, sent overseas to France, where I served 18 months in the trenches, was awarded the military medal, wounded and captured by a German officer at Soissons, and afterwards worked as a prisoner of war in a German salt mine. On returning to England, I was sent home on prisoner of war leave, and demobilised at home at the end of that leave. After my discharge from the army on the 25th of March 1919, I made up my mind to write a book on my experiences, as the havoc, desolation and destruction in the Great War so appalled me. Added to these was the torment of the vermin, the continual fear of death, the suffering and hardships. It all appeared to me as a thing that never should be. Surely human beings were never intended to go through such harrowing experiences. This book was written with the intention of doing good, of educating people who were not engaged in the Great War to understand what war is, not as some people would have us believe, but as it really is. And if it will make people realise the awfulness and uselessness of war in settling international disputes, it will have achieved the object with which it was written. Foreword. In writing this book, the author has had one aim in view: to put the true meaning of war before the reading public. It has in the past been put before the public as a thing of glamour, of thrilling adventures to stir the passions. Book after book has been written as to whether this battle or that battle should have been fought, and the controversy has gone on indefinitely. The writer holds that there should be no more war. It is an obsolete weapon of the dead past. We must not forget that all wars have left in their trail untold suffering, not only to those directly engaged in them, but to those who have had to stay at home and wait silently for the best, as many who are living at the present day know full well to their cost. There are many now growing up who have only faint recollections of the Great War, and others who do not know anything about it. They still read in some books that war is a glorious thing, full of adventure, but in compiling this narrative, the writer intends to show war for the loathsome, degrading, disgusting, and abhorrent thing it really is. The main idea in war is to kill human beings, and to kill as many as possible. This does not tend to uplift any man, and gradually sickens the stoutest heart. Those engaged in this bloody combat see war in its true colours. They hold no illusions as to what war really is. They know it for the foul, demoralising and degrading thing that it is. We must not lose sight of the fact that war always brings in its trail widows, orphans, the homeless, an army of maimed and crippled or sightless soldiers. These are all things that we have to expect from war. Not only that, but there are inevitably an army of civilians on the march, not knowing where they're going, having left their homes in fear of the invading enemy, walking day after day, night after night, wandering aimlessly, along with the few belongings they could snatch up before leaving. Little children tugged at their mother's skirts, crying as they tramp along the highway, their little bodies too heavy for their legs, tottering on, wheelbarrows, trucks, handcarts, all sorts of vehicles brought into use. When you have once seen this sight, it is a thing you cannot forget. It is enough to break a heart of stone. This is the irony of war. Not even women and little children are exempt from its cruel blows. We see monuments erected in different countries of the world to the fallen of the Great War. Every honour is due to the men who fell in that great struggle, and every honour is due to the monuments for which they stand. But we ought to see that such a terrible catastrophe does not happen again, and everybody ought to work hard to abolish the word war from every language. It stands in the way of all progress, bringing in its train death, disease, poverty, suffering, maimed and crippled, sightless, homeless humanity, and aching hearts for a generation afterward. Chapter 1. During the late war, I presented myself at the local recruiting office. Waiting in the rooms were already 30 or 40 other men, all bent on the same errand, to join the army. When the recruiting sergeant and the doctor turned up, we were told to strip to be medically examined. This seemed to us to be out of the question. To strip in front of other people. We all looked at one another as much to say, who's going to do it first? When the sergeant found out that nobody moved after we had taken off our coats and vests, he shouted out, "What the hell do you think you're on about? Off with those damn trousers and be quick about it. You haven't come to a mother's meeting. Now there, put a jerk into it. The doctor is waiting to examine you." We were to find out later that the sergeants did not mince words when addressing recruits. They believed in calling a spade a spade. You were not supposed to possess any feelings. If you did, they would soon take the edge off for you. Following the abrupt and not too polite language of the sergeant, we all undressed. As we stood there naked in front of each other, shame was writ on our faces. This was a new experience to all of us. To have to undress in front of perfect strangers is not a very nice thing to do. But, as we were to learn later, we were at the beginning of a new life where we should have to do many things we had never done before. We appeared in front of the doctor one after the other. My turn came, and as I passed A1, many were rejected. Others were passed in a lower grade, i.e. B2 and C3. Our papers were filled up. Afterwards we were lined up outside, counted off, then marched through the streets to the station to entrain for our depot. The town which we were leaving was Nelson, Lancashire. We were to entrain for our depot at Fulwood Barracks, Preston. When we arrived there, we were told to hang about the place until we were wanted. We were issued with blankets, etc. from the stores. That night, our first in barracks, not one of us had a wink of sleep. It was December and bitterly cold. Also, not used to being on army beds or boards, we tossed about until morning. There were one or two lively lads amongst the party, who must have thought the war was in that particular place, for they were itching to have a fight with anyone. I happened to remark that they did not want to bother about fighting, as they would probably get as much or more than they could want before they were much older. As it happened, they did not come to blows, for all the others took them at face value and left them severely alone. After lights out, tossing and rolling about my hard and comfortable bed, I thought how different this was to being at home, but decided that I would have to make the best of whatever came my way, as I was a soldier now. The next morning we were up in good time. Not having had any sleep, dawn came as a relief to us. We had a good look around the barracks until breakfast time, then we were told to go over to the large dining room, where all the men in the barracks had their meals. The first thing that I noticed when entering was the smell of fin and haddock. In fact, it seemed to have worked its way into everything in the place. Breakfast was a very poor affair. Dinner was much better, but the smell of fish still clung to the place and spoiled the taste of everything that was eaten. The smell stuck in the nose. In fact, when I think of it now, I can still smell that fin and haddock. During the afternoon, we were all paraded in the barrack square, where we were lined up, counted, and numbered off. This seemed to be an obsession with the authorities. Afterwards, we marched up to the stores to be clothed and equipped. This was a tedious job, but it became quite laughable as the man in charge went over each item in a soldier's clothing, equipment, and all sundry articles that go to his makeup. We then proceeded to the barrack room with all the things that had been issued to us. There was no small matter, for we had as many things as we could carry. Some of the men had to keep turning back to pick up the thing that they had dropped, to the accompaniment of much banter from the others. After changing into our uniforms, we were directed over to the table, where a clerk was sitting in readiness to take over all our personal belongings, so that they could be sent home, each man given a receipt. These were then packed up and forwarded to our homes. We got into our trousers and tunics all right, but when it came to putting on the puttees, we were at a loss how to make it start. These were about 2 yards long, and it was a very complicated piece of work to get them on and the way that they should go. Luckily, we had an old sweat in the room, who told us to gather round and watch how it was done. This we were only too willing to do, and after seeing him manipulate his, we all commenced to follow suit. Some made passable attempts, but the majority made a very poor show. At about 4 p.m., they told us they would be sending us home, as they had no room for us there for the time being. We thought this was too good, but it turned out to be true. From that moment, it was all bustle. We were all given kit bags, lined up, numbered, marched off to an orderly room, given passes for 5 days' leave, and then marched down to the station. This, we thought, was not so bad for a start. When I reached home, my wife had a shock. She did not expect to see me again until I went home on my final leave. It did not take her very long to get over it, and we settled down to home life once more for a brief spell. One little incident that happened the morning after our arrival in barracks was worth mentioning. 3 of us were walking around the building, passing away the time, and when turning a corner, we came across 2 officers. We were at a loss to know what to do, but on seeing them, I dropped my arms to my sides, as that was all I could think of. Not yet had any lessons in saluting. The other 2 men had their hands in their pockets and did not take them out until pulled up by one of the officers. He asked us why did we not salute when we saw them, and with a sharp order from him, 2 men took their hands out the pockets as if they had red-hot cinders in them. They were too much taken back to answer. So I told the officer that it was only our 2nd day in the army, and we had not yet had any lessons in saluting. He asked me why I had dropped my arms to my side on seeing them. I replied that this was the only thing I could do under the circumstances. He dismissed us with a caution to salute all officers in the future. We found out later that the 2 officers who had pulled us up for not saluting were both captains, one of them being an army chaplain who seemed to enjoy the joke of the other officer pulling up row recruits. We soon found that this was a very big thing in the army. In fact, you could not move without meeting officers. It was very annoying at first, having to salute nearly every few minutes, but we got into the way of keeping our eyes skinned, as the army term went, and if we could dodge around the corner on the approach of an officer, we would do so. After being pulled up for not saluting, we were very soon to learn that we could get pulled up for saluting. This happened one night when we were in the town. 3 or 4 of us had been having a look around, and were on our way back to the barracks when we met an officer, as we thought him to be. We all saluted, and to our astonishment, received for our trouble a good cursing in full army style. "Who the hell do you think I am? I'm not an officer. You must not salute me again." He turned out to be a regimental sergeant major. He was dressed like an officer, but had a brass regimental badge on the cuff of his sleeve, whilst officers had what were termed pips. Now this was another difficulty for us, to know who was an officer and who was not, but we soon got to learn the difference between them. After our leave was over, we returned to our depot in good spirits, thinking that the army was not so bad if we could get a leave so soon. On arrival, we had to get busy. We were leaving that day for a training camp in Shropshire. We were not sorry to hear this news, as not so many liked the barrack. After a lot of bustle and messing about, we finally got onto the train. We were just beginning to find out that the authorities could not do anything without a lot of trouble. They used to get us out on parade hours before there was any need for it, but I came to the conclusion in good time that all this was for a purpose, and that purpose was to crush your spirit, if you had any. They used to do the silliest things imaginable, only, as I have just said, it was to break your spirit, and to make you understand that you were part of a machine. When we got to our new training camp, where we were to be made into soldiers, we found out it was Priest Heath, just outside Whitchurch. We marched for miles after leaving the station, for the camp was right out in the country. We found it to be a tremendous camp, where all the men were put into what were called training battalions. We were lined up, numbered off, then marched off to a place allotted to us for sleeping and training, all the huts being around the square where we were to be trained. We all had to go to the stores to draw bedboards, blankets, etc., but after which we were again paraded and then dismissed for the day. The next day, our training started in real earnest. We were told to look at the orders that we were issued nightly at the battalion office for what had to be done tomorrow. About 30 men were allotted to each hut, with a sergeant who was responsible for the good conduct of the men. The sergeant told us after tea what we should be expecting to do, and that we should hear the bugle the next morning sounding reveille when we were all to get up. This was sounded at 5 a.m, and up we had to get. Any heavy sleepers who did not jump to it woke up suddenly amongst the bedboards, blankets, etc., all upside down. This was the gentle way the sergeant had of awakening the heavy sleepers and getting them out of bed. It caused a lot of fun, although the men who had been awakened out of their beauty sleep did not see much fun in it, and the language they used was shocking and not to be found in any English dictionary. As it was in the month of December and very cold, we thought it rather hard to have to get up so early. We had plenty to do, such as fixing our blankets, the bedboards had to be fixed in a certain way, then we had to shave, clean our boots, cap badges and numerals, and make ourselves presentable so that we could pass inspection by the Major on parade at 9 a.m. At 8 a.m, the bugle sounded again. This time it was for a welcome call. "Come to the cookhouse door, boys," which we were always willing to do. A wounded soldier was orderly of each hut, and he was allowed another man each day to help him to keep it clean. This was no small job, but everyone was eager to get it instead of being made on parade. The men on hut duty had to see that all the beds and blankets were tidy, the stove had to be black-leaded each day, all the utensils about the place had to be cleaned and polished until you could see your face in them. The floor swept and kept clean, and everything had to be spick and span ready for inspection by the orderly officer for the day, and if you found anything not as it should be, you would soon know about it. At dinner time, when everyone was seated, the orderly sergeant for the day would come round with the orderly officer. The sergeant would rap on the door with his stick, loud enough to wake the dead, putting the wind up everyone. Then he would shout, as if addressing someone 20 miles away, "Orderly officer!" That was the warning for everyone to be quiet. Those who were standing up had to spring to attention. Those who were seated had to put their knives and forks and all remain perfectly still. The orderly officer's duty was to see that the men were getting proper food, both in quantity and quality, and that it was properly cooked. Sometimes he would taste it, and finding all correct, they would pass on to the next hut, and we would then carry on with our meals. We now made a start with our training in earnest. First we had the simple movements such as left turn, then the right turn, then about turn, until we gradually got to forming fours. After a good grueling in all these movements, they got us to marching into line. Then came left wheel and right wheel. These are the simple things when you know how, but what a lot of time they took to learn properly. We, like most others, made a mess of it at first, and the names the sergeant called us and the places he told us to go to would not have been fit to put into print. Neither would the names we called him and the places we told him to go. But the big difference between us is that he could tell us to our faces what he thought of us, but we had to be content with thinking what we thought of him. After being put through our drills, we were handed over to the gymnasium instructors to be put through our paces. This came very hard upon men who had not done any physical culture exercises before, and made them stiff and sore. In fact, some of them got very little sleep from the pain they were consequent upon the exercises they were compelled to do during the day. I felt quite sorry for them, as it seemed to be more than they could stand. Quite a number broke down, not being capable of standing the strain. This part of the training I thoroughly enjoyed, and I always looked forward to it, as I had done a lot of physical culture at home before I joined up. We were also at this period of our training learning a new art, although not new to all. That was the art of swearing. To be able to swear proficiently seemed to be one of the things you must do. No matter what the conversation was about, nearly every other word must be a swear word. It seemed awful at first to hear this language wherever one turned, but, like all things, one eventually got used to it, and it became part and parcel of a soldier's equipment. This language seemed to have only one redeeming feature. It acted as a safety valve. If a man had not been able to have a good cursing match, he would have burst, as his life was so full of discomfort, petty fault-finding and discipline, that a good curse was the same to a man as a good cry is to a woman. After he had let off his safety valve, he would get on with the job. Sometimes, when it was raining, They would take us into one of the huts. It was very ingenious, the way they had us quickening up a man. I shall never forget the first time they took us into one of these. The instructor stood at each end, and the men occupied the other half. He had a very heavy walking stick in his hand, and he told us that we must jump out the way of it if he threw it as fast as he could. It was a lesson in quickness. He just shouted and the stick flew. Everybody jumped to get out of the way, for if anyone was caught on the legs or ankles, it would have raised a lump that would have taken a day to cure. It was rather laughable, although it was so serious. There was nothing to hold onto except the gas brackets and window ledges, and to see everyone scrambling to get out of the way was enough to make a pig laugh. Of course, I mean outsiders. This was the one where they had of quickening our eyes and brains. This exercise of throwing the stick by the instructor, as he explained to us, was to get us moving so quickly that by the time he had finished with us, we should be able to literally stick to nothing by the skin of our teeth. And as the time went on, we were convinced that he had not been telling us a fairy tale, for some of the men would swing up from window ledges about 2.5 inches wide, others grasp onto the open window to get hold of anything that they might be able to catch. It was really marvellous to see the way they got out the way as the stick came along the floor of the hut like a flash of lightning. One day, one of the men complained that he could not stand being put through the mill in the way we were expected, so the instructor called him out in front and asked him if he knew Mrs. Robinson. The man replied in a casual, offhand way that he did not know that he did. The instructor then told him, in his inimitable way, that he would soon know Mrs. Robinson's son, meaning himself. That was his way of explaining to recruits that if they were not careful, they would know about it, and soon. The hint was always sufficient. We went onto the gymnasium field one day, going through our exercises. One of the men, by the name of Horace, told the instructor that he was wasting his time being there, and that he had good work waiting for him at home, at good wages. He became very awkward, and refused to do as he was told. The instructor called the chief instructor and explained the position to him. The chief ordered Horace to run round the field 3 times at a good pace. They had difficulty to get him to move at all, but at last they got him going, but only at a slow pace. The chief told one of the instructors to run behind him to sharpen him up and keep him going. But they had all reckoned without Horace, who was stubborn to a degree. He would go no faster than a slow trot. They had at last to give up in disgust, after going half the length of one side of the field, he stopped and refused to move another inch. The chief then called 2 privates and had him put under arrest. They marched into the guard room. He was tried and got a few days' confinement to barracks. But if they thought they had cured him, they had made a great mistake. He was no better afterwards, and when he got up amongst us again, he made no secret about it, that he had no use for the army. We all thought that he was talking off the top. However, one day, when we went on a route march, we saw Horace going up a lane as if nothing was wrong. But a few days later, we heard that he had returned his uniform to the camp with a note inside to say that he had no further use for it. We did not hear from him again after this, but were all under the impression that he had got out of the army with his stubborn cheek, as they found out that they could not do anything with him. The first payday in the army was a thing to be remembered for many reasons, one of which was that one had to do so much to receive so little. An officer was seated at the table and no man received his pay until he saluted him correctly. Some were pulled up 4 or 5 times. This used to get up the back of some of the men, and if they had been able to put into words what they thought, it would not have been pleasant to hear. One day, the Major stood on the steps passing the time, as we thought, but this evidently was not so, as we found out the next day. He had noted some of the men passing him without saluting, and on this particular night, quite a lot of men had passed him without doing so. He gave the order the next day, when we were being dismissed, that we should have an hour's saluting drill after tea. This, he told us, was to teach us not to pass an officer without saluting. We had to get our tea and be on the parade ground in an hour's time. There was a lot of grumbling, but it did not make any difference. When we'd all got to the parade ground, we were formed into fours, then marched round and round. The Major stood on the office steps, and every time we passed him, as we went round the parade ground, we had to give him a salute. When the hour was up, we were all lined up in our platoons. He then addressed us, and told us that if any of us were found not giving the necessary salute, we should have to do the same again. I might say that we did not have to do this extra duty again, as the lesson had gone well home. One morning, on church parade, while we were being inspected, the officer stepped in front of me and asked me if I had shaved this morning. I replied, "No, sir," and told him that I had shaved the night before. He told the sergeant, who was by his side, to take down my name for being on parade without being shaved. He then passed on to inspect the others. The same night, when the orderly sergeant came round, he called out my name and told me that I had to be at the orderly room at 9 a.m. the next morning to report for being on parade without being shaved. This rather upset me for the time being, but I did not miss any sleep over it. When morning arrived, I got up as usual, shaved and polished up, and was spick and span and down at the orderly room before 9 a.m. Soon after my arrival, 2 privates and the sergeant turned up. The sergeant told the privates to fall in, one on each side of me. This seemed to be getting serious. I might have committed a murder or something of the sort, the way that they were going on. The sergeant went into the office to await the arrival of the commanding officer. He then came out again and brought us to attention with a sharp word of command. Then, "Quick march! Halt!" We were now inside the outer office. When we were all ready, the sergeant gave the order, "Quick march!" and I was told, as I was new to the experience of this sort, I was marching in with a cap on my head. He ought to have told me to remove my cap before entering the outer office, as I was now in disgrace. When he saw that I still had my cap on, he made one grab at it, and I thought he meant to pull my head off. Of course, that is only the gentle way they have things in the army. We marched in front of the commanding officer, who was seated on the table upon which were all sizes and colours of paper. I now stood to attention before him. He picked up a large blue paper and began to read. Rank, name, number. Then he came to the awful charge of being on parade without being shaved. After he had gone through all the particulars, he looked at me. He did not look a bad sort, and could see I was taking this to heart. He asked me if I had anything to say in answer to the charge, and I replied that, it being winter and dark, I had been in the habit of shaving at night, as we had more time then, and could get a better shave. After my explanation, he said that he would dismiss the charge against me, only with the caution to always shave in the morning in future. He motioned to the sergeant that he had finished with us. The sergeant gave an order. "About turn! Quick march!" And out we came. He then gave me back my cap, which still happened to be in one piece. One very good thing connected with the camp was the canteens, where the men could buy practically anything they wanted. They were also used for letter writing, and sometimes concerts were held there, which were well patronised by the men. There was also a wet and dry canteen. In addition to these, there was a YMCA in the nearest town. This proved to be a godsend to the men, as we could go out each night as long as we were back before lights out. On Saturdays, we finished our training at midday, and every Saturday afternoon we would see a long stream of men going to the nearest town. All would make for the YMCA for tea. After tea, there would, as a rule, be a concert. No thanks could be enough for the willing workers who were women, with the exception of 1 or 2 men to do the heavy work. All gave their services, and it was things like these that made the heavy life of a soldier in training bearable. Everybody seemed to be happy as sandboys when we were in the YMCA. At these concerts we were entertained by the pick of the music hall profession. They were always willing to do anything to brighten up things and have a real good evening when they got together. After we had become used to standing on parade ground with the weight of full marching orders, they took us for route marches. These became jolly affairs. In fact, most of the men used to look forward to them. After a little time marching, the officer in charge of the column would give that order that we could talk and smoke. All would commence talking at once, and smoke would rise as from so many chimney pots. Someone would then break into song, which was immediately taken up by the rest. Then we would march and sing up until the order came to fall out by the side of the road, when we would take off our equipment and dump it on the ground, so that we could get used to the full benefit of it, so that we could get the full benefit from the 10 minutes rest we're allowed every hour. It was a pleasant release to be able to remove the weight of the equipment from one's back, for we were laden like pack mules, and the burden was just as much as one could carry. At the end of the 10 minutes would come the order to fall in. All would jump up and struggle into their equipment and get back to their places in line. When every man was in the column, the officer would give the order, "Quick march!" and away we would go for another 50 minutes. These route marches did the men a wonderful amount of good. All seemed to benefit from the fresh air and the exercise. Sometimes they were spoiled by some of the men using filthy language, even singing filthy songs, until the officer gave strict orders that it must cease. One day orders came to our group that volunteers were wanted for the machine gun corps. We were paraded and asked who wished to have their names put down. I, amongst a lot more men, volunteered for this. Our names were taken, and we were told that we should have to be medically examined for fitness. This test consisted of a 3-inch chest expansion, good eyesight, and physical fitness. A good number of us passed the test. Several were turned down for various reasons. We had to strip for the examination. In fact, we seemed to always be stripping for something or another. But by this time, we'd gotten past the shamefaced stage. It all came in a... Hopefully, that all came through all right, and it all sounded okay. Any comments that you have, smash them in the comment section, and I will try and address them at some point. I'm going to try and get one of these chapters out every day if I can, or every other day if not, and then move on to another very influential book for me, which doesn't have an audiobook version of as well, and I'm going to move on to that hopefully just after Christmas. If anyone has any questions or anything, pop them in the comment section. Otherwise, have a good one.